Summer, 1967, Kowloon Peninsula, Hong Kong. The beach was crowded that afternoon. Students skipping lectures, dock workers cooling off after a shift, children chasing the tide along the sand. Among them stood a thin young man in dark trousers, his shirt rolled at the sleeves. Several witnesses would later remember the moment because of the laughter. Not loud at first, just the kind that spreads when a group decides someone in front of them is not a threat. One of those witnesses was Chan Wai-kung, a 19-year-old technical college student who had come to the shore with two friends. Decades later, in a recorded interview, he described the scene carefully. They thought he was showing off, doing those fast hand movements. Someone said kung fu was useless outside the movies. The young man they were mocking was Bruce Lee. At the time, he was not the global icon people would later remember. He was 26 years old, lean, restless, and known mostly within tight martial arts circles in both Seattle and Hong Kong. On that beach, however, reputation meant nothing. What began as taunting quickly shifted into something else. Several young men, witnesses later disagreed whether there were 4 or 5, stepped closer. They were local dockside regulars. Larger, heavier, used to settling insults without ceremony. The exchange lasted less than a minute. But according to Chan and 2 others interviewed years later, the decisive moment lasted about 12 seconds. 12 seconds between the final insult and the moment the group quietly stepped backward. No dramatic speech, no theatrical victory, just a sudden, controlled burst of movement that forced several men who had been laughing seconds earlier to reconsider how close they wanted to stand. Bruce Lee never publicly discussed the incident. There is no official record, no police report, no footage. Only fragments, recollections from witnesses who remembered the speed, the confusion, and one small but telling detail. One of the men who approached him left holding his ribs and breathing shallowly. What exactly happened during those 12 seconds has been reconstructed only through interviews and second-hand testimony. And even among those witnesses, one fact remained consistent. None of them expected the thin man in the rolled sleeves to be dangerous. They expected a show. What they saw instead made several of them step back without another word. 1967 was a volatile period in Hong Kong. Street confrontations between rival youth groups were common, and martial arts schools carried reputations that extended far beyond training halls. Bruce Lee was caught between 2 worlds. His rising influence in American martial arts circles and the skepticism of traditional fighters back home. His ideas about practical combat, stripping away rigid forms and adapting techniques, were controversial. To some instructors, it sounded like arrogance. To others, it sounded like rebellion. By the time he visited the Kowloon shoreline that summer, word had already spread through certain circles that Lee claimed most traditional methods failed under real pressure. That claim alone was enough to provoke hostility. The beach encounter wasn't arranged, but the moment Lee began demonstrating hand speed drills on the sand, the attention it attracted carried a predictable tension. In Hong Kong at that time, reputation could be challenged anywhere, even in public. And sometimes it was. 1967, Hong Kong. The city was restless that year. Street protests were erupting across industrial districts. Labor strikes disrupted transportation lines, and tension between youth groups had begun spilling into public spaces. In neighborhoods along the Kowloon Peninsula, confrontations between rival cliques were common enough that most residents learned to read the early signals: a raised voice, a tightening circle, the shift from teasing to challenge. For a young martial artist trying to establish credibility, reputation mattered almost as much as skill. And Bruce Lee carried a reputation that was already controversial on 2 continents. At 26, Lee was no longer the teenage street fighter many older instructors in Hong Kong remembered from the late 1950s. Since leaving for the United States in 1959, he had built a small but serious following in Seattle, later expanding his teaching to Oakland and Los Angeles. His students included university athletes, actors, and several individuals with prior boxing or wrestling backgrounds. What they encountered in his classes was not the traditional structure most Chinese martial arts schools preserved. Lee was openly critical of rigid forms and ceremonial routines. He believed combat should be direct, economical, and adaptable, ideas that would later form the foundation of what he called Jeet Kune Do. But in 1967, those ideas were still spreading quietly, often provoking resistance rather than admiration. Within traditional circles in Hong Kong, several instructors viewed Lee's approach as disrespectful. Many schools emphasized lineage, strict technique sequences, and loyalty to established styles. Lee questioned all of it, not politely. Former classmates later recalled that he spoke bluntly about what he believed failed under real pressure. Forms were too slow, stances too rigid. Too many practitioners trained for demonstration rather than survival. Those comments traveled quickly through the tightly connected martial arts community. Even instructors who had never met him personally knew the name. Some dismissed him as a talented but arrogant young man influenced too heavily by Western boxing. Others were curious, and a few were openly hostile. That hostility did not always appear in formal challenges. More often it surfaced in informal confrontations, the kind that happened in back alleys behind restaurants, outside training halls, or occasionally in public places where a crowd could gather. Lee understood the risk of those situations better than most people realized. His early life in Hong Kong had already exposed him to street fighting. As a teenager, he had been involved in several altercations between neighborhood groups, enough that his parents eventually decided sending him to the United States might prevent more serious trouble. The years in America had changed him physically. Witnesses who trained with him in California described a man obsessed with conditioning. He ran daily, lifted weights, practiced heavy bag drills, and refined his striking speed with relentless repetition. But returning periodically to Hong Kong meant stepping back into an environment where reputation could be tested without warning. And there was another factor. Lee was not large. At roughly 5 feet 7 inches and around 135 pounds during that period, he stood noticeably smaller than many laborers and dock workers common in Kowloon's working districts. Among men accustomed to settling disputes with blunt strength, that size difference often created a dangerous assumption. That assumption followed him everywhere. Several former students recalled incidents where strangers would watch him demonstrate techniques and react with skepticism. The speed impressed them, but speed alone did not always convince men who believed a real fight came down to weight and aggression. One of Lee's acquaintances in Hong Kong at the time, amateur photographer Wong Tak-sing, later described the tension Lee faced during those visits. People wanted to test him, Wong said in a recorded interview decades later. Not officially, just to see if what he did actually worked. Those tests rarely happened in training halls. They happened in unpredictable places, bars, rooftops, parking lots, and occasionally along the shoreline where crowds gathered on humid afternoons. The Kowloon Beach encounter began in exactly that kind of environment. It was not planned. No school arranged it. No rival master issued a formal challenge. Instead, it grew from something much simpler. A small demonstration on open sand. Lee had been practicing rapid hand drills, short explosive strikes meant to train reaction speed. The movements were precise and unusually fast, but to someone unfamiliar with martial arts, they could look theatrical. A few bystanders began watching. Then someone laughed. Witness Chan Wai-kung remembered that moment clearly because it changed the tone of the entire afternoon. At first it was curiosity, Chan recalled. But then one of the men said something about movie tricks. After that, the mood shifted. Among the group of onlookers were several young dock workers who spent much of their time along the harbor. They were used to physical confrontation and had little patience for demonstrations that looked like performance. To them, a thin man moving his hands quickly in the air seemed less like a fighter and more like an entertainer. The first insults were casual. Then they became sharper. Lee could have ignored them. Several witnesses later said they expected him to do exactly that. Gather his things and walk away toward the promenade where tourists and families were scattered along the concrete railings. But he didn't move. Instead, he continued practicing the drills. That decision, calm on the surface but quietly defiant, created the conditions for what followed. Because in Hong Kong in 1967, refusing to back down from public mockery could easily be interpreted as an invitation. And within a few minutes, one man from the group stepped forward. His name, according to the witnesses who later spoke about the incident, was Lung. The laughter around the circle had not completely disappeared yet, but it was already beginning to change. The distance between the men was shrinking, and the situation was no longer a joke. The man who stepped forward first did not look like a martial artist. That detail appeared consistently across nearly every witness recollection. No training uniform, no formal stance, no careful distance. Just a thick, shouldered dockworker moving across the sand with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to physical confrontation. His name, according to several later interviews, was Lung. No one present seemed to know his full name, but men who worked along the Kowloon harbor recognized him immediately. He was known in that district as someone who handled cargo loading crews, the kind of job that demanded strength, endurance, and a willingness to resolve disputes quickly. Witness Chan Wai-kung described him years later with surprising precision. He was not tall, maybe 5'9", but very solid. Thick arms, the kind of man who looked heavy even when he moved. That distinction mattered. Unlike a trained martial artist, Lung carried his weight through the shoulders and chest rather than the hips. His stance wasn't balanced for speed, but for the kind of close-range grabbing fights common around the docks. It made him difficult to move. More importantly, he had something many formal fighters lacked. He was used to chaotic violence. Harbor districts in Hong Kong during the late 1960s were rough environments. Arguments between labor crews often turned physical, and those fights rarely followed the neat rhythms of martial arts sparring. Men grabbed shirts. They shoved. They swung wildly until someone went down. Lung had likely been through dozens of those encounters, which meant that when he looked at Bruce Lee, he was not evaluating technique. He was evaluating size, and Lee looked small. At the time, Lee weighed little more than 60 kilograms. His build was lean, dense muscle, but narrow shoulders compared to the laborers who spent their days lifting crates and ropes along the docks. From Lung's perspective, the demonstration unfolding on the sand probably resembled something closer to performance than combat. Fast hands, sharp noises, but no contact. Witnesses remembered the first direct comment that triggered the confrontation. It came from somewhere behind Lung in the group of dockworkers. Chan recalled it roughly this way. Someone shouted that Kung Fu only works in movies. The remark drew laughter. Then Lung stepped forward. Not aggressively at first, just enough to shorten the distance between himself and Lee. Several witnesses estimated the gap had been about 2 meters when Lung stopped, close enough that a single step could close it. From the outside, the posture looked casual, but the intention behind it was unmistakable. Lee paused his hand drills. For the first time since the small crowd had gathered, the two men were looking directly at one another. According to Chan, Lee did not respond immediately. There was a brief silence. The beach noise continued behind them, waves breaking against the shore, children shouting somewhere farther down the sand. But inside the loose circle forming around the confrontation, the energy shifted into something quieter and more dangerous. Lung spoke again. Witnesses disagreed on the exact words, but the meaning remained consistent in every account. If Kung Fu worked, he said, it should work against someone trying to hurt you, not against the air. It wasn't a formal challenge. There was no ritual bow, just a blunt proposition. Prove it. Another man from the dockworkers moved closer to Lung's left side. A third drifted behind him, half inside the circle, now forming among the bystanders. What had started as a one-on-one confrontation was quietly becoming something else. Lee noticed immediately. One of the consistent traits described by his students in later years was his habit of constantly scanning an environment, not nervously, but analytically. Who was moving? Who might intervene? Where escape routes existed? On the beach that afternoon, those options were limited. Behind Lee was open sand leading toward the waterline. To the sides were spectators standing only a few steps away. Ahead of him stood Lung, with two companions drifting closer. The physical equation was shifting. 3 men within striking range, possibly more behind them. Lung closed another step. Now the distance between them was barely an arm's reach. Witness Chan Wai-kung later admitted that this was the moment he believed the situation would turn ugly. "I thought they would jump him," Chan said, because when the others moved forward, it stopped being a challenge. Lee still had the option to leave. Several spectators later said they expected him to simply walk past the group and head toward the crowded promenade where security patrols sometimes passed. Instead, he remained where he stood. Not rigid, not confrontational, just still. One small detail caught the attention of multiple witnesses at the same time. Lee adjusted his footing in the sand. It was a subtle shift, one foot sliding slightly behind the other. The movement changed his balance. Lower center of gravity, better traction against the loose sand. To anyone trained in fighting, the adjustment would have been obvious. But Lung and his companions were not analyzing stances. They were watching a smaller man who had not yet proven he could stop a heavier opponent. And Lung decided to test that assumption directly. Without warning, he reached forward. Not with a formal punch. Not with a martial arts strike. With a grab. The kind used in dockside fights to pull someone close enough for a headbutt or a heavy swing. His hand shot toward Lee's shirt collar. And in the instant that grip closed, the entire confrontation moved from taunting words into physical violence. What happened next unfolded so quickly that several witnesses later admitted they heard the first impact before they understood what Lee had done. The moment Lung's hand moved forward, the atmosphere around the circle changed in a way several witnesses later struggled to describe. Up to that point, the gathering on the beach had carried the loose energy of spectators watching an argument unfold. People were curious. Some were amused. A few were already drifting away toward the shoreline. But once physical contact seemed inevitable, the crowd reacted instinctively. They stepped back, not dramatically, just a few careful paces that widened the space between themselves and the confrontation. Within seconds, a rough circle had formed on the sand, leaving several meters of open ground between the two men. Witness Chan Wai-kung later recalled how quickly the noise of the beach seemed to fade. People stopped talking, he said. It became very quiet inside that circle. The setting itself made the situation unpredictable. Unlike a training hall or paved street, the surface underfoot was loose sand. Every step shifted slightly. Balance could disappear without warning if weight was placed incorrectly. For someone relying on explosive movement and precise footwork, it was a disadvantage. For someone accustomed to brute grappling, it could be an advantage. The wind blowing in from Victoria Harbor pushed light grains of sand across the ground in thin streaks. Footprints from the surrounding crowd had already broken the surface into uneven patches. Several witnesses later described seeing Lee glance briefly downward before the confrontation escalated, a quick assessment of the ground beneath him. It was the kind of habit that experienced fighters develop automatically. Understanding where you can move matters as much as knowing how to move. The physical arrangement around the two men was also shifting. Lung stood directly in front of Bruce Lee, close enough that a single step would bring them chest to chest. To Lung's left, one of his companions had drifted within 2 meters. Another remained slightly behind him, half outside the circle. The positioning was subtle, but it carried obvious implications. Even if Lung initiated the confrontation alone, the others were close enough to intervene. Lee understood that immediately. Witness Wong Tak-sing, the amateur photographer who had been standing near the edge of the crowd, later described Lee's posture at that moment. He didn't look angry, Wong said, but he was watching all of them, not just the one in front. Several spectators believed Lee might attempt to talk his way out of the situation. In public confrontations across Hong Kong, walking away was often the safest option. Many instructors taught their students to avoid street conflicts whenever possible. But the problem with leaving in that moment was the distance. To retreat, Lee would have needed to turn his back on at least 3 men standing within striking range. Anyone familiar with street fighting understood how dangerous that could be. A shove from behind, a sudden grab, a swing to the back of the head. The beach offered no barriers, no walls, no objects to control distance. Just open sand and a tightening circle of observers. Even the crowd's position created risk. If the situation exploded into a full fight, Lee had very little space to maneuver before colliding with bystanders. and that meant every movement would need to be precise. Witness Chan later admitted that he expected the confrontation to spiral quickly. When three men stand that close, he said, it usually becomes a group fight. Lung, however, appeared unconcerned about those dynamics. He had already stepped closer than most men would have during a casual argument. Now he stood within arm's reach, looking down slightly at Lee's narrower frame. Up close, the size difference was even clearer. Lung's forearms were thick, his hands rough from years of manual labor. His shoulders filled the loose shirt he wore, making him appear broader than Lee by several inches. To an outside observer, the outcome of a simple grabbing fight might have seemed predictable. Several people in the crowd were still smiling faintly, expecting to see the demonstration collapse the moment the larger man closed distance. Lee, meanwhile, had made one small adjustment that few noticed. His left foot had shifted half a step backward. Not a retreat, a repositioning. The movement lowered his center of gravity slightly and angled his body so that his right shoulder was now pointed more directly toward Lung's chest. It was not a traditional stance from any recognizable kung fu form. It was something simpler, balanced, compact, ready to move in any direction. Wong Taxing later said that the shift caught his attention immediately. It looked different from the way people stand in schools, he recalled. More like a boxer preparing for a punch. But Lung wasn't studying footwork. He had already decided how to test the smaller man in front of him. Instead of throwing a punch, something that could be blocked or avoided, he chose a method common in street confrontations around the docks. He reached forward to grab. The movement was sudden but crude, a large hand shooting toward Lee's shirt collar, fingers spreading to clamp down and drag him closer. In fights like that, once the grip landed, control usually followed. Pull the opponent forward, off-balance him, then strike. From the perspective of several spectators, it seemed inevitable that Lee would be caught before he could react. But those watching closely noticed something strange in the instant Lung's arm moved. Lee didn't step back. He stepped toward the grab. The motion was so small that many people in the crowd missed it entirely. But the witnesses closest to the circle remembered it clearly, because that single step, forward instead of away, set up everything that followed. Lung's fingers had just begun to close around the fabric of Lee's shirt. And in that same fraction of a second, Lee's right hand moved. What happened next occurred so quickly that several people later insisted they heard the impact before they understood the technique. The first exchange had begun. The instant Lung's hand closed toward the collar, the distance between the two men disappeared. Most street fights begin with hesitation, a moment where both sides measure distance, posture, and intent. But this exchange did not follow that pattern. It collapsed into motion immediately. Several witnesses later described the same sequence in nearly identical terms. Two movements happening at the same time. Lung grabbing forward, Lee stepping in. From the outside, the step looked reckless. Moving toward a larger opponent who was already reaching for control usually meant walking directly into a clinch, the kind of position where strength and weight mattered far more than speed. But Bruce Lee did not step blindly into the grab. He stepped through the line of it. Witness Wong Taxing later explained it as best he could. It looked like he went inside the arm before the hand closed. Instead of pulling back from the collar grab, Lee's left hand snapped upward in a short, tight motion. Not a wide block, but a compact deflection aimed at the inside of Lung's forearm. The contact was brief, barely a slap, but it changed the direction of the grab, just enough that Lung's fingers slid past Lee's shoulder rather than securing his shirt. At the same time, Lee's body rotated slightly to the right. The entire adjustment took less than a second. Now Lung's arm was extended farther than he expected, and his weight had shifted forward onto unstable sand. That small imbalance created the opening Lee needed. Witness Chan Wai-kung said the next movement happened too fast for him to see clearly. I heard the sound first, he admitted. Then I saw Lung's body move. The sound several witnesses described was not the crack of a full punch. It was heavier than that, a dull impact, close and compressed. Lee's right hand had traveled almost no distance. From where he stood, he drove a short vertical strike into the side of Lung's torso, just beneath the ribs. Not a wild swing. A compact thrust delivered from inches away. The effect was immediate. Lung's body jerked sideways as the air left his lungs in a harsh grunt. His grip, which had never fully closed on Lee's collar, collapsed instantly. For a moment he remained upright, but his posture had changed. His shoulders tightened. His breathing shortened. Several spectators later said they expected Lee to step back after landing the strike. Instead, he stayed where he was. Close, balanced, watching. The first exchange had lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but it had already disrupted the assumptions that had fueled the confrontation. Moments earlier, Lung had been the one advancing. Now he was bent slightly forward, one arm drawn instinctively toward his ribs. The laughter that had circled the group only seconds before disappeared completely. But the situation was far from finished, because Lung had not come alone. The man standing to his left reacted first. Witnesses never agreed on his name. Some believed he was another dock worker. Others thought he might have been a friend who simply followed Lung when the confrontation began. What mattered was his position. He was already moving before Lung fully recovered. From Lee's left side, the second man lunged forward with the blunt aggression typical of street fights. A wide swinging strike aimed toward Lee's head. The kind of punch that relies more on momentum than precision. Loose sand shifted under the attacker's feet as he stepped. From the outside, it looked as if Lee had almost no time to react. But witnesses standing closest to the circle later insisted the movement they saw next was even faster than the first strike. Instead of retreating from the swing, Lee pivoted sharply on his rear foot. The punch passed through the space where his head had been an instant earlier. Lee's left hand rose again, catching the attacker's forearm just long enough to redirect its path past his shoulder. And then his right side turned forward. Another strike. Short. Direct. This one landed higher, somewhere between the chest and shoulder. The attacker stumbled backward 2 steps, surprised more than injured. By that point, the crowd had begun to realize they were watching something very different from the clumsy brawl they expected. Lee's movements were not large or dramatic. They were tight. Every motion traveled the shortest possible distance. Every strike seemed to appear before the other man finished his attack. Witness Wong later described the sensation in the crowd during those seconds. People stopped breathing, he said quietly, because it didn't look like a fight we understood. But the confrontation still hadn't reached its most dangerous moment, because the third man, the one standing slightly behind Lung, had now stepped fully into the circle. And unlike the others, he wasn't hesitating. He was moving straight toward Lee. 3 attackers. Unstable ground. Spectators only a few steps away. In that instant, the situation teetered on the edge of something far more chaotic than a brief demonstration. Lee had proven he could strike first. Now, he had to prove he could control what came next. The third man entered the circle with none of the hesitation that had followed the first 2 exchanges. Witnesses later described him as younger than Lung, but taller, leaner, with longer arms, and the restless energy of someone who had already decided that stepping back was no longer an option. From the edge of the crowd, Wong Tak-sing saw the moment the situation changed. That was when it could have become very serious, he said years later. Because 3 men moving at once is not a test anymore. It becomes survival. The sand beneath their feet had already been disturbed by the earlier movements. Lung was still partially bent, recovering his breath after the strike to the ribs. The second man had stumbled back, but had not left the circle. Now the third man closed distance directly toward Bruce Lee. This time, there was no grabbing motion. He came forward with a driving shove of the shoulder and forearm, the kind meant to knock someone off balance before heavier strikes followed. Lee shifted his weight to meet it. Witness Chan Wai-kung later admitted that from where he stood, it looked for a split second as if the larger man might actually topple Lee backward into the sand. But instead of resisting the push with equal force, Lee redirected it. He turned slightly, letting the momentum slide past the center while his right arm rose between them. The motion resembled a wedge, not a strike, not exactly a block, but a structural interruption that prevented the full weight of the charge from landing. The attacker's balance faltered. His leading foot dug too deep into the soft sand. Lee moved instantly. One short step forward. a knee rising sharply into the man's midsection. The contact was not theatrical. Several witnesses later described it simply as a sudden folding of the attacker's posture. Air escaped from his lungs in a sharp gasp. He staggered back 2 steps, clutching his stomach. At that point, the circle around them had widened again. People who had come to watch were now moving farther away, some pulling friends with them as the realization spread that the confrontation had crossed into real danger. Lung striked Ned slowly. His breathing was shallow, but anger had replaced the earlier confidence in his expression. The first strike had embarrassed him in front of his companions. Now 2 of them had been driven back in front of a growing crowd. For men used to defending their reputation in the harbor districts of Hong Kong, humiliation could push a confrontation past the point where reason still mattered. Witness Chan remembered the look on Lung's face clearly. He was deciding whether to rush again. Chan said, "You could see it." Lee must have recognized it as well, because for the first time since the exchange began, he paused, not stepping back, not attacking, just watching the 3 men in front of him. To those unfamiliar with fighting, the pause might have looked like hesitation, but several observers who had trained in martial arts later interpreted it differently. Lee was measuring the next decision. He had already demonstrated that he could strike faster than any of the men confronting him. Another sudden burst of movement might have dropped one of them completely, but the setting complicated that option. Dozens of witnesses stood only meters away. If he unleashed the kind of force that professional fighters sometimes use when their safety is threatened, someone could easily suffer a broken jaw, a shattered knee, or worse. And Lee had spent years trying to convince skeptics that martial skill was not about reckless violence. Yet if Lung and the others attacked together, restraint might leave him overwhelmed. The balance between control and survival had narrowed to a fragile line. Lung stepped forward again, not charging this time, just advancing slowly, testing the distance. His companion with the injured ribs remained slightly behind him now, breathing carefully. The younger attacker with the bruised stomach had retreated another step, clearly reconsidering his role in the confrontation. 3 men had begun the challenge. Only one still seemed determined to continue. Lee adjusted his stance again in the sand, shoulders relaxed but ready. Witness Wong later recalled the small movement that followed. He lifted one hand, Wong said, "Not to strike," just like he was saying that was enough. There were no dramatic words, no speech to the crowd. Just a quiet signal that the exchange had already gone far enough. For a moment, Lung didn't react. The 2 men stood facing each other in the shifting sand, breathing hard in the humid afternoon air. Then something subtle changed. Perhaps it was the pain still tightening his ribs. Perhaps it was the realization that the smaller man in front of him had not used his advantage to humiliate him further. Whatever the reason, Lung's shoulders dropped slightly. He took a single step backward. It was not a surrender, but it was the first clear signal that the confrontation was ending. And within seconds, the fragile circle of violence that had formed on that beach began to dissolve. For a few seconds after Lung stepped back, no one moved. The tension that had gathered in the circle did not disappear immediately. It loosened slowly, like a rope being unwound after being pulled too tight. Several witnesses later said the strangest part of the entire encounter was the silence that followed. A beach that had been filled with laughter and noise minutes earlier now felt strangely still. Bruce Lee did not pursue the moment. He did not step forward to press the advantage. He did not look toward the crowd for approval. Instead, he lowered his hands and remained where he stood. The decision mattered. In many street confrontations across Hong Kong during the late 1960s, stepping back was not enough to end a fight. If the winning side pushed too far, even with a single humiliating strike, the losing group often felt forced to retaliate. But Lee did the opposite. He created space. Witness Chan Wai-kung remembered seeing him take 2 slow steps backward across the sand, increasing the distance between himself and the dockworkers. He didn't celebrate, Chan later said. He just stopped. Lung was still breathing carefully. The earlier strike to the ribs had not dropped him, but its effect was obvious. His right arm hung lower now, instinctively guarding the side of his body where the blow had landed. One of his companions, the younger man who had absorbed the knee to the stomach, had already drifted outside the loose circle of spectators. The third man stood a few paces behind Long, rubbing his forearm where Lee had redirected the earlier strike. None of them spoke. Several witnesses later described seeing Lung look around the crowd for a moment. There were no cheers waiting for him. No encouragement. Just a widening space between himself and the man he had expected to dominate minutes earlier. That moment of quiet evaluation seemed to settle the decision. Lung exhaled slowly, then took another step back. The confrontation ended not with defeat, but with recognition. Continuing would only make things worse. Within half a minute, the three dockworkers had moved away from the center of the beach, disappearing into the small groups of people standing near the promenade. The crowd began talking again almost immediately. At first the voices were low, uncertain, then louder. Spectators replayed what they thought they had seen. The sudden movement, the strange speed, the way the larger men had lost control of the exchange almost instantly. But the person at the center of the incident seemed uninterested in the attention. Lee bent briefly, brushing sand from his trousers. Then he returned to the small patch of ground where he had been practicing earlier. Witness Wong Tak-sing remembered watching him resume the same rapid hand drills that had drawn the crowd in the first place. It was like the interruption had not mattered, Wong said years later. He went back to training. That detail stayed with several observers. The demonstration continued only a few minutes longer before Lee gathered his things and walked toward the concrete walkway that separated the beach from the nearby streets. No one followed him. No one asked questions. And by the time the afternoon crowds began thinning toward evening, the confrontation had already started to transform into something else, a story. In the weeks that followed, fragments of the incident spread quietly through different circles across Kowloon. Some versions exaggerated the speed of the exchange. Others added details that witnesses never mentioned. But the core elements remained consistent. A group confrontation, a larger opponent, a fight that ended in seconds rather than minutes. Lee himself never publicly addressed the encounter. There were no interviews about it, no dramatic retellings in magazines or newspapers. To the outside world, it simply vanished among the thousands of small conflicts that occurred across the city each year. Yet for the people who had stood inside that circle, the memory lingered. Chan Wai-kung would later describe the moment with a kind of quiet reflection that appeared in many similar accounts of Lee's early confrontations. He said the most surprising part was not the speed of the strikes. It was the restraint that followed them. He could have hurt them much worse, Chan said. Everyone there understood that. In the years that followed, Lee's philosophy about combat would grow more refined. He spoke often about efficiency, adaptation, and the dangers of rigid tradition. But those ideas were never meant to glorify violence. They were meant to prevent it from escalating. The beach encounter in 1967 left no official record. No police report. No photograph. No formal acknowledgement. Only scattered testimony from witnesses who remembered the sudden shift in the air when the laughter stopped. Years later, when some of those witnesses reflected on what they had seen, one conclusion appeared again and again. Strength alone had not ended the confrontation. Speed alone had not ended it either. The outcome turned on something more precise. The ability to apply exactly the amount of force necessary, and then stop before the damage became irreversible. And perhaps that was the lesson the crowd carried away from the sand that afternoon. Because the most dangerous man on that beach was not the one who struck first. It was the one who knew exactly when to stop.